It officially started in December of 2007. That's when the NBER declared the recession began. That means we've just finished the third year and there's no end in sight. So this is a very long downturn.
When did they say?
December 2007 is the official starting of this date, NBER.
Was it officially ended growth rate?
Yes, they officially ended it, but I mean, if you count from the time they officially started and you disregard the ending on the ground, well, you do, on the grounds of how they measure, then we went to 10%, we're at 10%, and there's no end in sight.
When did they say the end was?
The end was this summer, sometime this summer, June, May, or something like that. You know how they measure that, two consecutive quarters of plus or minus growth is how they measure it. In any case, we are in a deep downturn that has now at least finished its third year, and no end in sight. I think that's the $64 billion question. How long, as in Europe, how long will the American people convince themselves it's temporary, convince themselves it's a hard time but we'll get through it, convince themselves that the downturn won't last that long, won't affect them personally, all the explanations, excuses, and arguments to not face a long-term secular downturn. Let me remind you of a history that we did the first time we began. Real wages in the United States went up famously for 150 years, roughly from 1820 to 1970. It's an amazing story. And you can understand a population that experienced rising real wages for 150 years, that drew millions of immigrants to come here precisely to participate in that story. You can understand if deep into the consciousness of an American people, the idea that it'll always get better would settle. It stopped getting better in the 1970s. The real wage of the American worker per hour today is exactly what it was in 1978. No change, 30 years. But the impact of that cataclysmic change in the condition of the working class of the United States was postponed. It was postponed by two phenomena. Working more hours, that's how you get your income up if your wage per hour is stagnant, and by borrowing money. By 2007, you had exhausted those two reserves. Women had become a full member of the workforce. They had not been that in 1970. They went out in massive numbers. Males took second and third jobs. Children took jobs. Old people took jobs. You can't do more work. And you can't borrow more money. Half the reason we're in this crisis is that the American people are capped out with debt. They can't handle the debt they got. They can't take on more. So you postpone the impact on a rising standard of living by working till you can't anymore and by borrowing. There's nothing left. Now, the postponed denouement, the French would call it, the confrontation with what has happened to you, now it has to begin. No more increases. Now it's down. You're going to have to pay off your debt. You're not even going to be able to consume the wages you get, and they're not going anywhere, those wages, which is why our economy is what it is. The wage isn't going up, so people can't buy. Plus, they're trying to lower their debt because they can't survive. That's a recipe for not buying very much, which is why we have our economic problems in this country. So there is a long-term confrontation with our history. That's what's underway here. And it's going to be a really interesting, to be as polite as I can, in one of the most violent countries on the face of the earth, it's going to be real interesting how a population begins to come to terms with the possibility of a long-term economic decline so that it looks exactly like all those countries that it used to watch on television telling itself, well, we live better than them. And what happens when we don't?
And that's where a danger is of a rightward shift.
All kinds of dangers lurk there. Right wing, left wing. Depends on how people understand it. Do they understand this as the evil activity of Muslims? Okay. Well, they might. There'll be people who give them that argument. Or that it's the Fed is doing it to us. Or immigrants, that's a good one. Black people, yeah, you know, the usual candidates for this scapegoating when you're in a deep trouble. But one of the reasons I spend as much time as I do personally talking about the history of wages, the way I just summarized for you, is to try to develop another way of understanding what happened and why it happened.
But isn't there a contradiction in the fact that these Tea Party people that they're voting for are the very people who a very short time afterwards are voting to slash the Medicare and Social Security and other benefits of the people? I mean, can people fail to notice that forever?
Hopefully not.
Question? No, it's a very good question. It may very well be that we are watching the Tea Party movement, which has happened many times in the United States, blow itself right out of the water, destroy itself by its accommodations to the political system in Washington when it arrives there. That's perfectly possible. That has happened on the left. It has happened on the right before. Why should we be surprised if this happens again?
Well, it's not accommodations, this is their program.
Well, no. Many of them have a program of something very different from that. They want the middle class, which they define themselves to be the focus of help. They went to Washington to get the middle class help. If they sign on to a program that allows the richest people to avoid a tax increase and gives the poorest people a little bit of help, leaving them out in the cold, that's going to be very difficult to explain to their constituents. That's not what they were supposed to do. That was not what they were supposed to do. As I've told you before, I haven't yet agreed, although some of you are advising me to do that, but I have been repeatedly invited to go and address Tea Party organization meetings. I find this extraordinary, because if you go to my website, you see the word Marx and Marxist just splattered all over the But it goes to your comment. If you don't want to see something, it isn't there. They want something else, so they're convinced that I might provide that. So I haven't gone yet, because I don't know exactly how I'd function over there, or whether I'd get out a lot. But it is part of the confusion in this country about where things are going. But I don't want to end without leaving you with that last point, that sobering thought. What if, since none of us can predict the future, and I'm not claiming to, what if we are underway in the early stages of a long-term decline in the standard of living of the American working class? What would be the political response that a sophisticated left wing, organized or not, would want to make to that phenomenon? How would we explain it, and how would we mobilize people, and against what and for what, as a way out of that dilemma? And if we did it, we might be the only ones to have a story to tell about that, that's developed and articulate and might get a response, partly because so many other parts of our population can't bring themselves to think, not even as a remote possibility. And that's because of our history. That's really all that is.
Discontinue the private ownership of production.
That's an older, traditional socialist claim. Marxist socialist claim. Go from private to public ownership
Of
and go of means of production, and go from markets to planning. Those have been the recipes.
Oh, I love Marx.
Well, I
The
ask
government
you.
is not impartial, sir. The government is not impartial.
Absolutely
It's
not.
partial to the rich.
It is. But the socialist idea was always that the workers would take over the government, so that the government that take over the private property would be a workers' government. That was the Soviet model. And to replace the market, which favors those who are the richest, with a planning system that is organized to meet people's needs, not to make private profit. I assume you all know this recipe. It's a very old, I don't mean to be disrespectful. In the 19th and for much of the 20th century, the fundamental claim of the socialists, in the face of the Great Depression of the 30s and in all the other injustices and inefficiencies of capitalism, was what that gentleman just said. Socialize the means of production and substitute a worker state planning the economy for the activity of a market. The interesting thing was not only that that was a very powerful and persuasive story, it did help to produce and orient revolutions in the biggest country by geography, Russia, and the biggest country by population, China, not to speak of other places. It won over the hearts and minds of millions of people. It generated a global Marxist movement that is powerful to this day. Every country on earth has Marxist journals, Marxist trade unions, Marxist organizations. It's extraordinary. The spread of Marxism in 150 years is much more impressive than the spread of Muslim or Christian religions. It took much longer to do what they did than what Marxism did. It's extraordinary.
They didn't have the internet.
They didn't have the internet.
Neither did Marxists for most of the time.
What?
Neither did Marxists for most of the time.
Well, that's true. So I'm not taking away the enormous achievements of that recipe, of that slogan, of that idea.